All right, welcome everyone to today's webinar, the 2022 Food Code and You, Key Information for Food Service Operators and Educators. My name is Dan Chancellor from the ServSafe team, and I will be coordinating this webinar today. We understand that the update to the Food Code is a big deal, and we want to leave time for your questions at the end. But before we get started, we do have a couple of housekeeping items. So first off, this call is off the record, and if you are a member of the media, please hang up and direct any questions to media@restaurants.org. This is not ServSafe certification training, and there are no continuing education credits offered, and there is also no certificate of attendance. You should see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and you can use this for any questions that you have about the content, as well as any technical issues that may come up during the presentation. And we'll answer all of your technical issues right away and answer as many questions as we can on the content once the presentation is over. And it should be noted that all the information that Patrick and Ben provide today is their own opinion. And as you develop your food safety plan, you should consult with your legal counsel and your own knowledge of the food code for confirmation. And then finally, yes, a recording of this presentation will be emailed to you today, actually, shortly after this session is over. So today we're going to hear from Patrick Guzzle and Benjamin Chapman. Patrick has been involved in retail food safety for almost 20 years. His career as an environmental health specialist in Pocatello, Idaho, began way back there, and he was later hired as the Idaho Food Protection Program Manager. In 2018, Patrick started Mountain West Food Safety LLC and was the principal consultant. He is now the Vice President of Food Science and Safety here with the National Restaurant Association. And then we have Dr. Ben Chapman, who is a professor and food safety extension specialist at North Carolina State University. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. Ben is the Agriculture and Human Sciences Department there. With the goal of less foodborne illness, his group designs, implements, and evaluates food safety strategies, messages, and media all the way from farm to fork. And through reality-based research, Ben investigates behaviors and creates interventions aimed at amateur and professional food handlers, managers, and organizational decision makers. And you probably are familiar with Ben as he co-hosts a bi-weekly podcast called Food Safety Talk, and you can find him on just about every social media platform. And actually, to start things off today, we're going to hear a few words from Larry Lynch, who is the Senior Vice President of Health, Safety, and Regulatory Services, to talk about ServSafe. Larry, take it away.
Thanks, Dan. And really, I'm excited to welcome everybody today. You know, what you're going to experience today is really a key part of the mission of ServSafe. And that's to prepare the industry for keeping their employees and their attendees, their restaurant attendees, participants, and their customers safe and healthy. So we've anxiously been awaiting the food code. The FDA finally released it at the very end of 2022, and so we've been spending a lot of time reviewing it and making sure we understand the nuanced changes so that we can prepare the industry. And that's the goal. We talk about ServSafe. We talk about a program developed for the industry, by the industry. And it really is our ability to reach out, talk to experts, have people on our team like Patrick or experts that we work with like Ben to really help us understand what restaurants need to do to operate safely. And that's what we're going to do. So today is really that first look at some of the major changes we're seeing coming out of the food code this year. I think you're going to find some things that are particularly interesting and enlightening. Eventually, some of that will make its way into some of our training and certification. But for right now, we just want to get you prepared on the things that you can do best to serve your customers and your employees better. So I'm anxious to turn it back over to Patrick. I don't want to waste a lot of people's time today. They've got a lot of great stories to tell, a lot of great information to share. So at this point, Patrick, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Larry. Ben, it's always good to be speaking with you. I'm thankful that you could join us today with your time. As we go through what we're going to discuss, I think it's important to keep in mind, as Dan mentioned earlier, this is our reflection of our opinion of what we think are the primary changes to this food code. Other agencies or other organizations might look at this and say, we don't think that's a big change. That's okay. I think it's important to understand that the food code is a model food code. It is published by FDA. Ultimately, states have to adopt it as their own food rules. They can adopt it at any point in time, and they must go through their own process to do that. It's also important to recognize there are potentially different rules for the Federal Nutrition Program and how they adopt the food code and what might all be applicable with their approach. So, all that said, next slide, please. Ben, we knew this one was coming, and we think this is the biggest one. Sesame has been added into the food code as the 9th allergen. We typically thought of 8 allergens in the past. We've now added sesame. Now, we're a little bit behind on this. I think other countries have considered sesame to be a food allergen for some time. Ben, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, absolutely, Patrick. And thanks again for having me join you today for this discussion. As you mentioned, I don't think this was a big surprise for us as we looked at changes within the food code. We know that sesame in many parts of the world is considered to be one of the most important allergens, has been for quite some time. And really, as we look at the incidence of sesame allergy happenings, events, those have really gone up here in the U.S. over the last decade. And so it was really, I think, prudent that when the food code changed, that it also reflected this. It also reflects consistency with the rest of the Code of Federal Regulations, because as of January 1st, 2023, the CFR also lists sesame as a major allergen that requires labeling. And so, I think the big thing here to keep in mind is this isn't new. It's not a brand new allergen. It's not something that is just come on our radar. I think it's just the being recognized consistently across all of our food rules nationally here in the U.S. Some might ask a little bit about, are the allergy responses to sesame different, essentially within the body, and many of the allergic reactions resemble those as what we would see in tree nuts, peanuts, as well as soy. So it's again, from a scientific standpoint, it's not a new one for us, but it's one that we've just caught up with, and there just has been an increased recognition of these incidents over the last decade. And next slide, please.
Yeah, I think one thing that is new, though, for us, Ben, I don't recall seeing language like this in the food code before. Of course, that top bullet has been there for a long time. We know that employees need to be properly trained in food safety, including food allergy. But then the second bullet point presents a different level of knowledge that I don't remember seeing in the past, where food allergy awareness includes the food employee being familiar with the symptoms of a food allergen. And you were starting to reference some of those in your previous slide. I don't recall seeing language that requires the employee to be aware of this. I think it's an important step. I think that it presents a little bit of a question for how restaurants will manage this in the future, knowing that not only does the manager need to know about this, but now food employees also need to know about food allergens and their symptoms associated with it.
Yeah, and I'd add here, Patrick, that this is a really great, best practice that many companies are already doing, especially those with strong server connections or counter connections to consumers, being able to be that front line in really recognizing when someone may be experiencing some sort of an allergen situation, and so I think it's just reflected here. Specifically in the code that recognize what many people were already doing, as you mentioned in your preamble, but now it becomes something that is essentially required under that code. And I'll highlight in that first bullet that you mentioned this idea of proper training as well. So making sure that that managers and PICs, people in charge, are and certified food protection managers are training their employees along this awareness for allergies, and that, as you highlight, that before the 2022 food code, that would only include the 7 common allergens of wheat, eggs, fish, shellfish, soy, peanuts, tree nuts, and dairy, and now we add in the sesame to that list.
Yeah, and I agree. This is certainly important for food workers and managers to know about. One quick story. I have an adult son. He's 28 years old, and he was diagnosed with a severe tree nut allergy at the age of 5. Just this last winter, he was at a company event, and they catered in this nice dinner, and the dessert is served. It's like a chocolate mousse inside what looks like a graham cracker crust. And he asked 3 or 4 different people if there were nuts in it, and they all affirmed no, there were no nuts. Well, after he took about 1 bite, he realized right away there were in fact nuts in there, because he had all those common symptoms: the itching in the mouth, the swelling of the face, the other symptoms that go along with that. Well, he later learned that the souffle cup itself was in fact made with crushed walnuts. And it was interesting that 3 or 4 people all said, "Oh no, there's no nuts in that," when it literally was made of nuts. Next slide, please. Now here's something else, and this really presents some interesting considerations for restaurants specifically. So this labeling section typically applies to bulk foods for consumer purchase, and we typically don't see this in a restaurant. Where we would see it is in a grocery store, perhaps. But the question comes into play about, well, what about items on a salad bar? And I've gotten mixed answers from this. I've kind of asked around a little bit. I have been told by one jurisdiction that they would absolutely look at the items on a salad bar as needing to be labeled. So think of at the end of the salad bar, you're going through, you've got your nice salad plate, and then you grab a breadstick or something, and maybe there's sesame in that breadstick. That might need to be labeled by some jurisdictions. Conversely, other jurisdictions have told me, no, they don't really look at that salad bar as they need to be labeled in this case. So this is really going to depend on, I think, restaurants working with their local health departments to identify, do we need to label this or not? This is going to come down, I think, to an interpretation from some jurisdictions. Any other thoughts on that, Ben?
Yeah, Patrick, I think that this highlights something that you said earlier, that as we go through the implementation of this new food code, this 2022 code, that having a conversation with your local regulator about that interpretation becomes really, really important. And that's something that can be, a struggle for restaurant operators that may operate chains or are part of a franchise that operate in different jurisdictions. And that's nothing new, that those different interpretations, but this is one where we've got a situation that becomes really, really important to just understand exactly what's going to be required with your local environmental health officers. The other thing, sorry, go ahead, Patrick.
I think our next slide talks about additional concerns with compliance. So could we go to the next slide, please, while Ben is continuing?
Yeah. So one thing here that I do exactly want to highlight is this idea of thinking as a restaurant operator now I need to add this allergen of sesame to my list of things that I want to ask my suppliers about too. I think your example about breadsticks with sesame seeds on them is a great one to think about, where certainly that breadstick would have been part of my wheat allergy concern, but now all of a sudden I've got to be thinking about all of my menu items that may have these sesame seeds or something that's hidden. Certainly that's something that we would see with rolls, sandwich rolls and hamburger rolls with sesame seeds as well. But just really, really thinking about what I'm doing within my operation, and if you're someone who's supporting the restaurant industry, how you're helping those operators with these questions as well.
Yeah, and I'm pretty involved in the Conference for Food Protection, as are you. I think that number one item there, reports of intentional addition of sesame, I think that's going to become an important topic at the Conference for Food Protection, which will be held later in April. Next slide, please. When we talk about time as a public health control, there were a few changes that were made to this. I'm going to ask Ben talk about this one in the next slide. Ben?
Yeah, absolutely here, Patrick. So this one, it gets a little nuanced and complicated, and really only comes up if someone is using or wants to use time as a public health control already. And so what kind of the science dictates here is that within those 4 hours, and I shouldn't say the science that's been presented where the model food code is based on, is that we know that bacteria can grow at certain temperatures, and in the ambient temperature within a restaurant or food establishment setting, we've kind of set this time of 4 hours as being important, because the growth, although the pathogens can be growing, they're not growing often to a level that increases risk. And so this time as a public health control section really clarifies a few things that if someone is using this this approach, that it really gets to, like, is it a ready fruit or vegetable that's being cut? Is it a ready or sealed food that when it's open, that time as a public health control really kicks in? And then I think one that I want to highlight here is that the food temperature doesn't exceed 21 degrees Celsius or 70 degrees Fahrenheit within that maximum 4 hours from the time it was rendered time as a public control for food safety food. And so I think, going back to something you said earlier, we want to highlight that this is an important change because it's something that's there. What it means to an individual business really needs to be reviewed within their own teams to understand what exactly are the procedures that are being followed right now. Patrick,
as you're talking about that.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, as you're talking about that review process that needs to take place internally, it might push some of the responsibility back onto food workers. If we could see the next slide, please. So as we can see with this slide, if you look at that bottom bullet point there is language in the food code now that talks about employees properly maintaining temperatures of TCS foods. This specifically mentions during hot and cold holding, but there's also a reference that talks about during cooling right above it. It talks about making sure that, and note, I think the important factor here is that it's talking about employees' routine monitoring of these food temperatures. So I think this edition of the food code is really starting to say, you know what, everybody's responsible for monitoring some of these things, including the people who are working with the food. The employees might be responsible for this. It's not just a managerial concern. And so to go to what you were saying, where there needs to be an internal review of our teams of how we're controlling this, I think this is going to become a really important factor to consider. Who is responsible for monitoring those temperatures to ensure that we're within safe temperature parameters?
Yeah.
Next slide, please. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so I was going to say, before we leave this, I just want to highlight a couple other things here, right? So the big change, and this is where you're exactly right, the employee interface really matters, is that prior to the 2022 food code, time as a public health control did not allow for food to start at an ambient temperature, but required either cooling or heating before it could be used. And ultimately, that's going to fall into, as you highlight here, an employee. It's a procedural issue, but it's going to require an employee change for that. And the other one that I'll highlight on the change that I mentioned in the last slide, but I think really matters here when it comes to employees, is that the new parameters allow for food that are TCS once cut to be cut at room temperature for use in time as a public health control. And so that kind of changes a little bit of the training aspects behind anyone who would like to use time as a public health control. So yeah, absolutely want to reinforce your thoughts here that the procedural aspects are one thing, but how it gets communicated and what ultimately food employees are going to need to do becomes important for everyone to think about.
Great information. Thanks, Ben. All right, next slide, please. There was some information changed about hand washing. Next slide, please. So, after years and years of debate, I believe this debate has taken place for at least the last 12 years that I know of with the Conference for Food Protection. The Food Code has definitively defined the proper temperature for a hand washing sink, or for the water in a hand washing sink. And you can see it right here, it's highlighted, at least 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Now this corresponds with the Uniform Plumbing Code, which has a range of temperature, and that 85 degree mark falls right in the middle of that range. But I know, this has been debated for quite some time, gone back and forth. I know I know there's a great deal of scientific information out there that tells us that that's not the most important factor for washing your hands. The most important factor is having the lather on your hands. However, there's also a comfort factor, and that temperature of 85 degrees is generally comfortable for the majority of people. So we see that minimum temperature now of at least 85 degrees Fahrenheit at a hand washing sink. Any additional thoughts, Ben?
We can go to the next slide, and just I'll highlight a couple of things here. As Patrick mentioned, this is, again, I think what the Food Code is trying to do, and those at FDA behind it, is to make things as consistent as possible. And that's really been one of the issues related to water temperature. And so this, as Patrick highlighted, it is in line with another Uniform Plumbing Code that the federal government puts out and makes recommendations on. I'll just reiterate and support a few things that Patrick said, that you said, Patrick, just that there's a lot of a very deep body of literature, scientific literature and scientific studies that support the statement that you said, that hand washing temperature, it's not like hot water is killing bacteria on hands. It actually has to get extremely hot, way above 85 degrees Fahrenheit to do that. And so, there are many studies out there that show that water temperature for hand washing has no impact on pathogen removal during hand washing. And so, although there's a specific temperature here, it really is not about sort of the science of hand washing. Hot water certainly utilizes additional energy than colder water and can increase burn risk. And we've seen, anecdotal evidence of that in hand washing situations within food establishments over, the last, at least certainly over the course of my career. And as Patrick said, the biggest factor here that we see that is supported in the scientific literature is that the water temperature is really a factor of comfort, and the more comfortable the temperature is for individuals, food employees, the more likely they are to attempt hand washing in the first place. So if it's too cold, they're less likely to attempt hand washing. If it's too hot, they're less likely to attempt hand washing. And so, this happy medium of 85 degrees Fahrenheit really retains that comfort for employees, and it has no measurable impact on hand washing effectiveness. So that really, I think, is the big message here. Is it lowers the temperature slightly and allows for food establishments to recognize that the comfortability of their employees is really a factor in public health here. Next slide.
Yeah, Ben, you mentioned the hot water, and my understanding is that if we were to use hand washing as a kill step, the water would have to be so hot that it would cause significant burns to our skin. So we've agreed on a water temperature, and I think we're good now with this. Next slide, please. So this has also prompted a lot of discussion over the years. Many communities are allowing animals, specifically pet dogs, to be on the premises of a food establishment. However, historically, a strict read of the food code does not allow this. Many regulatory jurisdictions and a few industry agency organizations were asking FDA to give us some guidance on this. And the food code doesn't give a lot of clear guidance on this. Instead, what the food code says is, as you can see in the highlighted language, if approved by the regulatory authority, food establishments may allow pet dogs in outdoor dining areas. Now, this, I think, opens up a lot more questions, and we unfortunately don't have time in today's webinar to go through this potential list of questions. If you have questions about this, I would encourage you to submit them, because I fear that what this does is it opens up the doors to every health jurisdiction having their own interpretation of what's going to be allowed, which is really the same problem that prompted this discussion in the first place. So I'm not sure that this really resolves the question of allowing pet dogs on patios. I still think there are some potential public health concerns that could be associated with this, but I also recognize that many municipalities and states are allowing this to take place on a regular basis. Next slide, please. So, one thing that I found interesting about this when we put this wording in is you'll notice in the food code, if you look at a hard copy or the PDF version of the food code that's available online, this section of the food code is italicized. Now, you have to really know the food code to understand this. You have to go into some of the preface pages. But when something is italicized in the food code, what that means is that it really is not a hard, fast rule. It really is an exception and depends on several factors. And so we're, I think, kind of right back at the beginning of this discussion, like I mentioned in the last slide, about, what is allowed on the premises of a food establishment for referencing pets in this case. And I don't know that we have a clear answer yet. Ben, anything to add?
Yeah, and Patrick, I'm a fan of this, and I'll be pretty clear on it, because I think what we've had, and you highlighted the problem that led to this. I don't think we've solved it, but I think the issue that we've had is just inconsistency in handling specifically dogs, pet dogs in food establishments. And from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, I can speak frankly, specifically about things that I've seen in my state and other states, where it's really been handled in a way of like almost variances and sort of different messy ways to approach this. I think what the food code does here is it says this is allowed if your local health authority allows it. So let's put the decisions there. I will highlight that there is, again, science here behind this. There was some work that was done by the Food Standards Australia and New Zealand back about a decade ago that really looked at incidences around really risks of foodborne illness and public health risks associated with dogs, essentially saying that their work, a risk assessment, showed very low to negligible risk associated with particularly dogs in outdoor dining areas. This I guess change allows for local regulators in conjunction with their local businesses to make decisions that make sense at their at the community level, which it takes away some of the confusion, because I know that there were certain local jurisdictions that essentially looked and said it's not in the food code, so we don't even have a way to go down this path. And now I think the change allows it. What I do and certainly support is there's nothing in the food code with this change that says all of a sudden dogs or other pets are allowed inside the food establishment, in the dining area, in the cooking area. But I do think that there are things that need to be managed, things like dog bites and allergies. But it allows for the discussion in a way that it hasn't allowed for it in the past.
Boy, some great information there that you're sharing with us. Next slide, please. All right, there's new information in the food code about food donations. It kind of helps clarify what can and cannot be donated. And from my perspective, I think this is a great addition to the food code. I think this really helps to clarify what is allowable. And it's unfortunate that we even have to, I think, consider the concept of food donation. I think that, but I know that we do. And so I appreciate that there are now provisions in the food code that kind of help to clarify what the safety parameters are around food donation. Ben, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I'm a huge, again, fan of this. I often find myself working in the interface between food donation, food safety, food waste, and food disparity and insecurity. And up until this point, in the 2022 food code, the food code didn't actually provide any specific guidance on food donations. And this is, again, something that I've worked in different states around. States often had varying policies, and this allows for some specific recognition that this is an issue and something that needs to be focused on. Certainly, food donation can reduce retail establishment food waste and aid these populations that are insecure, and also that are often at higher risk for foodborne illness. And so it provides a foundation to again have this discussion and recognize that it's something that's happening, but provide a starting point for state and local regulators to jump off of. And it's also something that is made mention in the CFR. And so the Code of Federal Regulations. And so this allows for some focus on less confusion where there's consistency. So again, I'm a fan of this. Fan of this.
Yeah, change. Like you, I am too. Yeah, I really agree with you there. I'm a huge fan of this concept as well. I didn't mean to cut you off there.
All good.
Next slide, please. All right, there was a small change, but it's a very important change regarding ready-to-eat foods. Next slide, please. So we now have language in the food code that specifies if food is packaged and it contains instructions on the packaging that the food must be cooked, it cannot be considered in a ready-to-eat form. An easy example of this that I think of is what a lot of times we'll see on the salad bar, frozen peas. A lot of times people will put frozen peas out on the salad bar. I love them on a salad. They're wonderful. But there's a potential problem here. Those peas in a frozen state may not have been processed in a way that actually destroys pathogens. So if there is a label information that says this is not a ready-to-eat food item, it must be cooked to a proper internal temperature, then it cannot be considered RTE food. It must undergo that cooking step or that kill step before it can be considered ready to eat. So think about peas on a salad bar as we think about this. I know that an underlying concern with this, with the frozen food industry, was associated with listeria. A lot of times we were seeing listeria outbreaks, and it came down to the fact that an item was consumed in a ready-to-eat manner, even though it wasn't actually ready-to-eat food. Ben, you want to add to that?
Yeah, Patrick. I think this is something that clarifies an issue that's been an ongoing problem that could, without this clarification, and now following from both a training and compliance standpoint, could lead to increased foodborne illness, especially in certain situations where people who are high risk for listeria maybe eating and purchasing food. Essentially, you already highlighted this issue around frozen peas and vegetables. I won't go too much further in that, but one of the issues is that the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations I mentioned a few times, allows manufacturers to forego processing steps if they disclose that the product had not been processed to control hazards. And what this does, it puts in the food code that says this means that now if you are utilizing those types of foods, that it puts the onus on the restaurant business or the food establishment to figure out, are there cooking instructions? And if they are, we need to follow them. And if they are not, the part B here, for food which the manufacturer has provided information that has not been processed, it's got to be cooked according to time and temperature appropriate for the food if it's to be used in ready-to-eat foods. And so, again, I think it's something that many food establishments were already doing, but putting it in the code makes it so it's now an issue. But I think it highlights a challenge, which is that retail operations really need to be aware of the potential hazards in the food products that they receive so that they can adequately reduce those hazards before service. So like in the case of frozen vegetables, we certainly know that there has been again, anecdotally, situations where frozen peas, corn, veg mix might be slacked on a service table to bring them to room temperature, and then just bring them only to room temperature, and then utilize them within a cold salad. I think about frozen peas in a cold salad, and essentially what this does is say you really cannot do that if this product in their manufacturer's cooking instructions require that there is going to be heating for cooking for risk reduction. And so I think this is an important one. It's a small change, but it's an important one for food businesses, food establishments, and managers to really understand.
Yeah. Next slide, please. And this is another one where there's been a lot of discussion over the years about what exactly does it mean intact steak versus non-intact steak. And we see some definitions in the food code now that kind of help clarify that. I'm a big fan of this one. Do you want to talk more about it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is one that I'm very, it's very near and dear to my heart, because our group here at NC State has done a lot of research in this area, and sort of the confusion around definitions around intact meat, non-intact meat, mechanically tenderized. Does it include injection? Does it not? Just techniques that are used, especially in butcher shops, around vacuum tumbling or pounding. And what the food code does is recognize the inconsistency, now makes it consistent, but the inconsistency of how USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service approach these foods. And so the change to this definition means all of the foods that might fall under this, regardless of the federal agency that's regulating them, now are consistently looked at. And that I think always one of the things that we have to worry about is confusion at the local level. Having consistent definitions at the federal level really is important, and I just applaud FDA for making this a consistent definition.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Next slide, please. All right, one final one that we're going to talk about today, and that is the cook-chill process. Next slide, please. So we have some new language in here regarding cook-chill. As we know, it can draw a vacuum on that food, which of course makes it a reduced oxygen packaged food, which increases our risks for several organisms of concern. But there is some more clarifying information around the cook-chill process. Ben, why don't you explain a little more about this cook-chill process? I think you're pretty well versed in this.
Yeah, this is something that we certainly encounter a lot, and especially with institutional food service, with work that we do here in North Carolina. And this is one where there was a storage option that was allowed in the 2009 Food Code, but then it was deleted in the 2013 Food Code. And unless you're a real food code nerd, you might miss those. But this was an option that was used regularly. And so the reason why it was deleted had to do with clarifying exactly the parameters around it. And so the pathogens that we have a lot of concern about with that if it's being cooked chilled, we don't expect to have a lot of pathogen growth below that 34 degrees Fahrenheit, because in a cook chill situation, the cook is really reducing the chance for Listeria monocytogenes. And so this really focuses on clarifying the growth of Clostridium botulinum, non-proteolytic types of Clostridium botulinum. And so they really don't pose a major public health risk at 7 days below 41 degrees Fahrenheit. And so that's where this came in, was really tightening up the wording specifically around this these parameters. And so I'm again a big fan, because I think with this new provision, it recognizes a practice that was happening and puts some guardrails around it in a way that won't increase public health risks.
Yeah. If we could have the final slide, please. So we've only spent the last 40-ish minutes talking about a few of the changes in the food code. Again, these are the changes that we thought were pretty significant to talk about. It's certainly possible that you may have other questions or comments about changes in the food code, and I think we welcome those. I know the question and answer section is the question portal is open, but I'm going to go ahead and turn the time back over to Dan Chancellor to help address any outstanding questions or comments. Dan.
Hey, thanks, Patrick. Yeah, the Q&A box is still open, and we're trying to collect as many of these as we can, but love to see the engagement. We're going to answer what we can in the next 15 or so minutes, but keep asking, and we'll find some time after the webinar to see if we can follow up. So we're just going to do some rapid fire here, guys, and take care to answer. Either one of you can answer whatever I ask here. So the first is this code in effect now? A lot of questions around the idea of when is this implemented? When is health department going to look for changes or try to regulate this? How much time do we have?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really depends on where you live and what your jurisdiction is. I know there are jurisdictions out there that have adopted the food code as soon as it's published. There are other jurisdictions, like where I live, that have to go through a pretty lengthy legislative process, and it would be at least a couple of years before they get to that point. So this really is going to depend on your local jurisdiction, unfortunately.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add to that, Patrick, is regardless of whether it is effective in someone's local jurisdiction or not, I would back that the most updated version of the food code provides the most science-based up to the minute or up to date recommendations as well. And by recommendations, what I mean is even if you're in a jurisdiction that's following the 2013 or 2017 food code, these what's in the 2022 code really represents where we should be going as an industry and as a community, and striving for that because it's the most science-based and up-to-date information. So I know that in many jurisdictions and for many companies, they strive to focus on the most up-to-date food code as where they want to be. So I just, regardless of effective date, I think it represents where we should all be striving to be.
Good information.
There were actually some questions kind of along those lines. The idea that states do not have to necessarily adopt the food code, though. It's a state by state basis on whether or not they choose to adopt this.
It is a state-by-state basis. So FDA has made it abundantly clear throughout the years that even though they publish the food code, they do not have jurisdiction on retail food establishments, including restaurants and grocery stores and things like that. So consequently, this is something that is up to the individual state to enforce. This is within the state's purview, if you will, or the local health department's purview. Again, depending on where you live and how that structure is for where you live.
So a lot of questions about the allergens updates, and there was a handful specifically regarding labeling. And is it just sesame that has to be labeled in salad bars, or is it all of the big 9 allergens?
That's a great question. When I was doing some consulting, I would tell people to remember that the food code is kind of the minimum standard, right? So certainly advisable to consider labeling for all 9 of those allergens if those allergens are present on the salad bar. And again, that's going to take some management oversight and determining and identifying what are the allergens that might be in my salad bar is one example. Yeah.
Nothing to add.
And then, thank you, Ben. Does the labeling apply to more than just salad bars? We had a lot of questions from caterers, from schools, from pizza places. Can you say any more about the requirements of labeling?
Another great question. So I'm looking at the food code, and it simply says bulk food for consumer self-service. Now, that could be open to some interpretation. I think it might apply to catering operations. I think it could apply to pizza chains. It's not really super clear, but again, I would also say that in conversations that I've had, some jurisdictions have already been looking at this for a while. Other jurisdictions have not looked at it. Again, my best recommendation would be to plan on labeling foods if it is available for consumer self-service.
Is sesame oil included as a sesame allergen?
Another good question. Ben, do you want to handle that?
Yeah, so I guess similar to peanut oil, here's a situation, right? So when we look at oil, if it's highly refined, it's had the protein removed from it, but that basically relies on you understanding as an operator, or you understanding as someone who's procuring that oil, on how highly refined is it. And if there's some level of guarantee certificate of analysis that shows that it is allergen free, and I do know of a few businesses that do that as it relates to certain oils that they use for frying. I am not aware of it, and again, this is relatively new. I haven't seen it in the marketplace, but I'm not aware of any vendors right now that are selling allergen removed allergen-free sesame oil, and I don't know enough about the refining process of sesame compared to things like peanut oil to really answer that question. But I think it becomes a conversation between whoever you're purchasing oil from and what they are able to provide as a guarantee on whether it needs to be labeled or addressed at all. But it's a great question.
We've got a lot of concern around the idea of employee awareness when it comes to allergens and what it means for an employee to be aware, or like what training would be involved to ensure that you've done your part to make sure that they're aware. And so I'm curious if there's anything more you can say around what awareness might look like or how to ensure that employees actually are aware of allergen risks.
Yeah, so, and I can, I'll jump in at the start of this to say exactly what the food code says about this, because I think the wording is really important here. It says food allergy awareness includes describing foods identified as major food allergens and the symptoms that a major food allergen could cause in a sensitive individual who has an allergic reaction. So it's two things there, right? It's understanding the foods, all 9, they're identified as major food allergens, and the symptoms. And so there, again, I feel like we're a bit of a broken record on this. It really comes down to interpretation in each individual jurisdiction. Certainly a jurisdiction based on this could ask, as during a routine inspection, directly to a food employee who's working there to describe foods identified as major food allergens. Whether they utilize that in their scoring of or really evaluation inspection of that jurisdiction or of that establishment comes down to the jurisdiction. But the food code does really define what they mean. And so to the second part of the question, it's about what kind of training would be needed. It's really it falls to the food premise to make sure that their food employees are able to have this awareness, be able to report what foods, what not, those 9 foods are and those major food allergens, and what the symptoms they may cause for anybody who is defined as a food employee. Patrick, I don't know if you have any further to add.
Yeah, Ben, I agree with everything you're saying, and I will add that there's going to have to be some management oversight in this as far as sharing information. There are numerous tools out there to help provide that information. We have a course on allergens. It's one of the best that helps an employee really understand some of these things that Ben was talking about in terms of what foods might pose an allergy threat and what the symptoms are, and most importantly, how to react to a situation where a guest is exposed to a food allergen. So we've got courses out there to help you with that. But even after you take the course, the most important thing is going to be monitoring employees and making sure, helping them recognize what all has to be done here. I share the concern that there is an onus on the employees here, and it's what the food code is now going to require. So I think there are tools out there that can help us get to where we need to be, and I would encourage us to use those tools effectively.
And I just want to point out that ServSafe Allergens course does include sesame. It was updated last summer and is kind of ahead of the game as far as that goes. Some questions or concerns in the TCS Foods area that a lot of people are saying the number used to be 6 hours for how long it can stay, and now we're saying 4 hours. Was that a change? Is there a misinterpretation of that? Can you speak more to the difference between the temperature control being at 6 hours before and 4 hours now?
And you know the science behind this better than I do. Could you maybe explain that a little more and give us some examples of what kinds of foods might fall under this?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Caught me a little bit off guard here. So in the I would say that the 6 hours has been jurisdiction by jurisdiction. Sometimes I think where people are very much focused on has been the 4 hours. Essentially, what I can sort of share about time as a public health control is that there, from a bacterial standpoint, the things that we're worried about pathogen wise have what's called a lag period, meaning even if the bacteria is in the greatest conditions, they're not always ready to grow and to start to divide and create more bacteria or create secrete toxins as a byproduct. So the idea here is that it takes some time in time as a public health control to really focus on this. And so what the changes do with what we look at time as a public health control here is that it didn't allow for any food to start at an ambient temperature. And now if it's starting at an ambient temperature, it clarifies 4 hours. And so I just want to be really, really clear that that's the big change here.
Yeah, so as you described that, I'm thinking of, like, for example, if I've got a cantaloupe that I slice up, once I slice that cantaloupe, it's now a TCS food. And I think that if I were using time as a public health control, historically, I might have been told, you know what, go ahead and refrigerate that cantaloupe before you slice it. And if you do that and the internal temperature of the sliced cantaloupe doesn't exceed 70 degrees Fahrenheit, then you've got a 6 hour hold time on that. Now I have the option, and I'm looking at it as another option of slicing that cantaloupe at room temperature. And now, provided I don't exceed a certain temperature parameter within 4 hours, I'm still okay using time as a public health control on that sliced cantaloupe. That's just one example, but that's how I'm looking at this.
And so we have just an insane amount of questions. There have been almost 1,000 questions asked already in the chat during this hour. And so I just want to let everyone know, if we haven't gotten to your question, we're still going through them. We're pulling these questions out, and we have some plans to do some follow-up events to answer some more of these questions and to create some content to help get your answers. But if you have a pressing question that you need answered, use that email servesafe@restaurant.org and reach out to us, and we can get back to you as quickly as we can. Gentlemen, we've got 2 minutes left, so if you have any closing comments or thoughts, I'll let you end it here.
I just want to once again extend my thanks to Dr. Chapman for sharing this time with us. His time is super tight. He is involved in so many things. He's one of the nation's foremost leaders when it comes to retail food safety. And so, Ben, just thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Oh, no problem at all, Patrick. And, absolutely anytime. I think it's important that when we have changes like this that are so substantial to the food code that we all participate in a forum to discuss it and ask questions and answer questions and see what it really means. And so I just appreciate you inviting me and giving me the forum to participate. Thank you.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you both.
Dan?
And the reminder to everybody, thank you. Just a final reminder that this recording will be emailed to everyone who's in attendance today, and anyone who registered but didn't show up. You should receive that in your email within the next 2 hours, it looks like. So again, thank you guys, and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.